a lot of you don't know in your generation the real philosophy and spiritual principle behind the Middle East or Iran and Islamists and Muslims, Africa, Europe, the US, the understanding of attitudes, culture, the intersection of culture, interdiction of culture, language, family, ancestral, tribal traditions, practices, the things that make you you. You talk about your old Italian family, your Austrian father, your Russian or Swedish or Finnish, Danish background, your Guyanese, Taiwanese, Korean, Japanese, your Polynesian, your Hawaiian, your Kenyan, your Nigerian, your South African, your French, and Canadian, all of these various. I'm sorry if I didn't mention your land, my little Eskimo, but there's so many. The Cherokee, the Apache, the Mexican. There's just too many to go down the list. Cultures are different, and their values are different. The bikini was introduced in the late 50s, early 60s in the US. Bathing suits were pretty much covered. There's no butt cheeks showing and string covering your private parts. It was covered. Bras, no, there was one piece, a cover. There was a lot more puritanical, conservative kind of respect of the temptation of the body on society and on people. So it was covered to try to control and as well as to direct and guide as young people, particularly young boys, are coming into puberty and young women for decency. We are human, and it is natural to do what you can to control things that can distract you through the eye. In certain books, you couldn't just publicize public pictures of nudity or on billboards. There's certain things that are just not done. And that's kind of universal throughout most cultures throughout history until you look at the pagan practices that really stems from paganism and is worse in liberalism. I want to do what I want. I want to be free to do what I want. I want to walk around. No, I get it. There might be some comparisons to ancient tribes in the jungles or on the islands where you did not have a big enough banana leaf to cover you, or you didn't have textile industries woven string to that level. So you get a lot of people who will look at that. Now, if you want to walk around like an Amazon unknown tribe and that's your culture, I guess that's a little different thing to discuss. But do you know that expression, when in Rome, do as Rome or be as Roman? There are just certain attitudes, and even in the tribal system as well. But I don't really need to talk about that because I'm not talking to a bunch of Amazon jungle people with spears and strings. But I'm talking directly to those things that affect the colonized Western countries and those countries in the Middle East, what we considered morally civilized and decent to do and carry yourselves in a civilized way. And based on what we know, just like in our modern society, you got to be dressed a certain way when you go to court. You got to be dressed a certain way when you go to your college classes, and you got to be dressed a certain way when you go into a public space or a restaurant. These things don't require an unnecessary uh, uh, dissection of some sort of intellectual argument or debate. It's just pretty much common sense, the way we should conduct ourselves and how we should carry ourselves, whether we're in a classroom, whether we're in a courtroom, whether we're in a public space, in a grocery store. There's just some kind of basic things that we understand. And there's some basic things that we all can agree with. It's inappropriate, right? May not necessarily be criminal. It's just inappropriate. It's just not proper. So when you understand that, you can see the nature of a lot of people in our lives. Parents. There are parents that are immoral. There are obviously family members that are immoral, neighbors that are immoral. And so immorality is a major barometer and metric for the decay of your character and your integrity. It's just natural. And you see a lot of people, when they look at the old Roman Greco Empire, they say the same thing. You can see where there was great moral decay results in great decay. And moral decay does tend to be sexual or luxury. You get so luxurious, so consumed with just being drunk, being high, eating foods and sweets and partying and sex. You lose your strength of character. Those are not the kinds of people that make great soldiers. Those are not the kind of people that make great leaders. You can be compromised quite easily when you're so heavily induced with a desire to be high, to be drunk, and to be sexually turned on. That's just the way it's gone through history, and you see it in the area of addiction in America and in the West. It is something that's very common to people where there is more prosperity, more luxury, more leisure, more pleasure. It becomes more sleazy. And it is very sad for me to have to talk about this particular subject in lieu of the current events in the world, as well as in reference to what's happening at the Islamist activity in the Middle East, in America, and in Europe today. And while we do talk about what happens with conflating Islamists as well as with North Africans and what they do when they come into a former country that colonized them, there is also mixed in that the understanding of those moral differences, obviously religious, but also moral differences. And there are a lot of moral differences to look at. Before I talk about Islam's moral indifference, I want to first remind the people in the West of people like Charles Wesley and John Knox and so many puritanical, theological, C.S. Lewis, others who preached, ministered, wrote about the decline of the Roman Empire, the decline of Europe, the decline of the West. And it was very common in the 1800s and early 1900s to see a great movement towards the immorality of Western industrialization and prosperity. And it was something that was always a battle, particularly in the United States, where preachers and women activists were in the street marching against strip clubs, brothels, massage parlors. Women would, in the 1800s, they would be dressed in their full regalia, covered from head to toe, when a salon, a bar, opened up in their town, and particularly out in the West, because here comes the industry that's exploding with men building and mining and digging. And these men are not necessarily believers in God, and they're not preachers. They're just blue collar, hard-working men. And at the end of a hard-working day, they want a hard-working drink and a hard-looking woman. And so here comes the towns that actually grew from these mining industrialization explosions, and they grew. But when they grew, they didn't grow because they did with families, because the men went out, and these were long days and hard work. And a town wanted to know what most men want. And men like that want a hard drink and a hard woman. And you get these homes that were set up, these uh, these kind of like bed and breakfast type places, mostly typically run by women, actually. They would come in town and give a room and a meal to a man because he's away from home, doesn't have a wife. And apart from the meal and a bed to sleep in, when they wanted to let loose, they wanted to drink. And here comes the music, the drinking, and the women that want to fulfill the man's sexual needs. The brothels, the strip clubs, vaudeville, all of that, uh, that has been historically what you see springs up in a town that's full of hardworking men. And it becomes a separate industry all to itself. Eventually, some of those men marry the hookers, marry the bar girls, marry all kinds of different people. Towns start. The pubs continue, the brothels continue. And in this environment of industrialization and booming town development, churches spring up because we still have a country with a lot of views that are very deep and puritanical and fundamental. And somebody's coming through town because the sheriff has to deal with crime, and the sheriff's got to deal with crime, then he's got to bury the criminals that get shot. But you got to get a preacher, got to have a coroner. That's how a lot of the law firms got started. So the cottage industries all sprung up in the average town. Your coroner, your bail's bondsman, your court, your doctor, the bar, and your preacher. Somebody's got to say a prayer. And the church. Some of them are having kids. Well, your education. Now you got to teach the children that are being born. And they're going to have most of those schools in churches. The churches started the school system. The school system wasn't started separate. The churches is where they went and got educated. The classroom, then eventually they made a separate building. But it all started in the churches, teaching. And the women who wanted to see the men become holier would partner with the pastor for all of the different functions to try to get the men in the church. Not to say there was no men in the church, or there were men, but the larger population of working class men. Obviously, your doctor went to church, the sheriff went to church, the coroner went to church, the mortician, those types of people that were running the town administratively wanted to be considered upstanding citizens and moral. But you had both growing up together as towns were expanding. And when you see that growth and you understand that, you can see the battle that was going on spiritually in America for morality. And the more we grew financially, industrial growth, economic expansion, The wider the tent got, the more the sin exploded, nationally and internationally. And with that came a great surge of moral decline. There was a lot of movements about it. The civil rights movement was a part of it. The women's suffrage movement was a part of it. But there was great attack aggressively spiritually by the preachers, not that different than the the Islamic imams preaching against their culture. But I will get into that in a second. And the televisions on Sunday were filled with preachers. Most of the stadiums were used where preachers could go and invite the city. I believe it was Billy Sunday that started it, and then Franklin Graham. And a whole host of Catherine Kuhlman type women from the Foursquare Church and people like Jimmy Swaggart and R.W. Shambach, D.L. Moody, many great preachers. They would do it underneath big tents. Elmer Gantry, you heard that one? They would do it under big tents in a city. This was before the era of stadiums. It started with tents. And they would hold a meeting all week, all month sometimes, and sometimes for weeks and months. That tent would get a plot of land, and every night people would come in. Prostitutes, drunks, city officials, Hollywood people, all kinds of people would come in, listen to old gospel music, and the preacher would begin to preach, mostly against the moral sins and decline of the country. And that's how that started. The history of that is too much to go into in the podcast. But that was the beginning of quote unquote Christian television. And the merchandise industry of Christian books and Christian recording artists and music and anything and everything to answer the rock world, all of the rock stars, all of the Hollywood stars. Women wanted to be actresses. They wanted to dress like them, act like them, look like them. And they often say when you look at when the women come in, the men will follow because they're actually following sex. And so you'll find a lot of instances where the women were leading men astray. And the woman suffrage movement was trying to get the righteous women to bring the men who have strayed back under the big tent of God and the gospel. So a lot of the churches were full predominantly, disproportionately with women who still had a little bit more of the puritanical fundamental desire than the men. But what the flip of the script is that this suffrage movement evolved into a feminist movement. And then it flipped the script where now it wasn't about the women trying to bring the country into morality. It was about the women thinking about their freedom from morality. Now that was used as a chain by a lot of the people in control, and they wanted liberation from anything. They want to look, and again, Hollywood was the main impetus for this new image, Maybelline makeup. Women started to see the clown face of merchandise as a sign of beauty and not the beauty of holiness as a sign of beauty. The hard work of a home life and farm and kids, the devil started to tell them, don't you want that dress? Don't you want that fur coat? You saw it in the magazine. Don't you want to be like the French women? And they started to look at their lives as mothers and wives and industrious women from Proverbs 31 as a burden and a curse rather than a blessing. And that broke, even before there was no fathers in their home, that broke down the family enormously. Whereas the women were leading the way to the moral march to more holiness, they also led the way to the immoral march to godlessness and perversion. And you saw this grow decade after decade, and it permeated everything. The ad marketeers of Wall Street began to say, we can get more eyes on our product and more money out of their pocket into our banks if we use sex appeal. And the ads began to change and they became sexual. Everything was, how can we use the lure of the woman to get the men to buy and get the women to buy? And the women would buy by painting a picture in mass advertising where it would make the women appear to be desirable. And the women that appeared to be desirable didn't look like most of the women at home. But the women at home were watching these television shows, these radio shows, they were reading these magazines, and they were telling the women what beauty is. And the women began to look with their eyes what beauty was. And the men are on the sideline and they know that they're going into the strip clubs and the brothels and all kinds of different things. And so they figure out, well, let's turn the woman at home into the woman of the night. And let's start making her look no different than the stripper. Maybe the man won't stray. And rather it was talking about buying a frying pan or putting mascara on your face or buying a new car or a dishwasher, here comes the women agents of mass marketing. And you always had to have a woman in high heel shoes, typically blonde hair, loaded with makeup, extremely thin, tight dress. And the more that the show, the body show even greater. In the 60s, you could not show a woman's belly button. And most of the television shows, that was not allowed. Well, that changed and that diminished and got even smaller. And now they found themselves in a situation where now the more, the better. And we started something called the beach movies. And the beach movies end up exposing so many of the women and the children all had their eyes on the naked girls on the beach. Then it went into the music videos. Slowly but surely, we became quite an immoral culture. And teenage pregnancy, teenage sexual diseases exploded. It was amazing. Along with divorce because of adultery, and the whole country just exploded with this grave desire for more sexual forays into the things that were not of God. And it increased over a great deal of time. Despite the preachers on television, despite the revivals, everyone was fighting against it. Moral majorities, religious, political action groups started, women action groups. I think it was Beverly Lachey, and she started an organization called Now. Her husband, Tim Lachey, or Tim LaFay, he started the whole Left Behind series. And there was a great effort, but it could not equal the tide of immorality and hedonism that was growing in America. And we started to look like ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and we became much worse than we were in our founding. We became more liberal, more progressive. Woodstock, the Beatles, rock and roll, everything, Elvis, all of these things, everything sprung up. We came out, some say at the end of World War II, but remember, the Roaring Twenties was not that different, it was worse. And after World War II, people just wanted to let their hair down and get wild, and they did. And that has reverberated to this modern generation. The way parents were raising their children and the things that the children saw their parents to do, not to mention the drugs, mostly from their parents. The smoking industry, everybody got in on it. Corporations did, businesses did, banks did, politicians did. The corruption became marketable and it became a financial windfall. And of course, in the spirit of children growing up in rebellion, it was paradise. And so we saw this increase in our country. But when America began to export itself, because people around the world are watching our TV shows, listening to our music, buying our product, the great American land of prosperity. And it just looked fun and wild, the lust of the eye and the pride of life. And as we grew, we expanded and marketed that around the world. And people that didn't have the kind of economic success and all of the leisure and the homes, everybody wanted to live in paradise. And they wanted to be like it. And many countries wanted to act like, dress like, talk like Americans. They were listening to American music, watching American movies. And Hollywood was the great propagandizer of American culture through mostly movies and music. And our celebrities and our leaders, the message of America. And why did it grow so fast? Because it became very advantageous to the intelligence organizations to defeat communism around the world, to give people, don't you want to live like we live? Look what we have. Look what we do. Look at the cars we drive. Look at how our women are. And so it appeals to the baser part of our human soul, our human nature. And countries that didn't look anything like us, wanting to be like us, it just looked fun. And sin can look quite fun. And that's exactly what happened. And it was able to grow tremendously around the world, the image, the American image. But when that image went into the Middle East, it didn't have the same effect as it went into Europe or portions of South America. Not the same effect, because the culture in the Middle East is thousands of years old. And remember, the most expansive empire were the Muslims. Jews did not form empires. They were a kingdom uniquely set apart for God's purposes to represent God's Torah. And they were a persecuted people. But Islam, much older than any other nation, this modern nation, has been going through the world for over 1,500 years, destroying anything that did not fit their Islamist views of morality. And that was their main driving aggression, how they distinguished themselves from other people, foreign gods, idols, and immorality. And they saw people as infidels, violators of God's moral laws. And those views were the fuel for their conquest and their aggression. That was the main energy behind them. They were not like nations out of Europe as colonizers. No, their philosophy was much stronger, much deeper, because it was a religious fervor, not the preachers of America. No, this was very strong religious fervor. And they became intolerant of anything that made their women look like prostitutes or whores. And their Islamic teachings, that is the core of their beliefs, that if you don't hold the women to a higher moral standard, everything falls. They are the glue of the family. So once we lose our daughters, we will lose our family, we will lose our men, we'll lose our society. So they figured in Islam to put a much stricter code of morality upon the women because, well, as Job said, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look upon a woman, not to be led astray by the eye. And the male, obviously, is the one trying predominantly to mate. And when the woman is immoral, it will break up families, it will destroy a man's character. And that's the siren spirit of antiquity. Lure the men with lust and kill them. That's long before Islam. And they recognized the importance of women. And so they figured that that's kind of the key. After all, Adam was led by the woman, and the Bible says so. It was Eve that was deceived, not Adam. He was led. And so you have this situation where they are a woman is the most dangerous to man's existence, or she can become the greatest helper to man's existence, the helpmate. When she's a Proverbs 31 woman, she's the greatest asset any nation or any man could have. But when the woman loses that, the family will fall. The men will stop fulfilling their roles to chase a prostitute. And unfortunately, today, they don't have to chase a prostitute, they're married to one. And it's very sad because God is not centering their lives. Most women are prostitutes in the West. They're not trying to be mothers or wives. They're too busy in Pilates and at the gym and the yoga pants and exercise. It's all gone completely off track now. It's off the rails. And Islam sees this. And when you look at, and if you understand and do your history on Lebanon, which is called the Paris of the Middle East, it's, well, the French, wherever they went. First, it was Muslims that went and destroyed African cultures, particularly those that had Christian churches. Now, the Christians of Africa were not like the Christians of the West. So there is a little difference there. But slowly, they would become that. It doesn't take long for you to lose your very conservative culture and become liberal Christians. And you had a lot of that happening. And then you look at what the colonizers did. Rather, we're talking about Lebanon, or rather, we're talking about Iran. And they went from protesting the king because he was considered an abusive well, let's just say he was a materialist king, the Shah. And people didn't like him. It's just too much. It's like, but they didn't know what was waiting. Sometimes the devil you got is better than the one that you don't know that you're going to get that is worse. You know, mom was bad enough, but the stepmother is even worse. And so at some point, when Iran had its revolution against the Shah, against the king, their idea was that economically things would be better because there was this religious faction in Iran. And although they started the revolution, it's like Hitler. He started off uh, not as the Hitler that we've come to know. It was, well, we just want to be, Nazi means nationalist, nationalist, socialist. We want to, after World War One, he was trying to rebuild the country. Well, we have some pride. We've been humiliated. We got to pay all of these war reparations, and we've lost our credit to the banks, and because of what our, and he's just hated. I don't. He's Austrian German, or not even blonde, but of course, that's a whole nother issue. But he used the attitude, the the kind of position where the Germans kind of lost their status. And he wanted anybody that's trying to make you feel better about yourself and better about your country, well, that kind of will make you feel good because you've been so put down now, and you're so humiliated. Now somebody comes around and says, I'm tired of this. Enough of this humiliation. We don't have to take this anymore. They're just using it to keep us down. We can rise up again. And yeah, well, that sounds nice and good. Your country. You started that mess in World War One, but that's okay. You're tired of it now. You want to get back to being a respectable country and not feel like you're the whipping boy of everybody else in Europe. And then it turns into hate. Then it starts turning into blame. Yeah, you're the reason why we're like this. Who's in charge of the banks? They're the reason. Look at them. That's right. And so this hatred turns. We're gonna get aggressive. And so Iran had this kind of revolution with Khomeini. Khomeini started that aggression. And they didn't know what they were getting into at first. And it started off rather small, like a trickle. And then it became a river, a waterfall, and a torrent. Because what was motivating the revolutionaries was religious fervor. And the religious fervor, most of the Iranians did not know how far that would go, but they found out. And why? Because the religious group, the Islamists in Iran, felt at its core what it was watching was the decadence of the West becoming their nation. That's how the Islamists viewed it. In the 80s, we used to blame MTV for the decadence of our children. It's those videos, those rock videos, and it's that music. The rap music came out, and they had all kinds of actions against rap music. That's how we had to put warning signs on the CD packaging for the albums, right? People see that this thing is contributing to juvenile delinquency. And so mothers, again, banned to try to stop rap and rock music. Everybody get on the stage acting butt wild. And that butt wild dancing led to butt wild drinking, led to butt wild drugging, led to butt wild sexual diseases and babies born out of wedlock, and then eventually led to abortion. It's the same attitude that the Islamists had in Iran concerning the West and watching the debauchery. It just looked too much like what we're not. And that's how they saw it. We're looking like Europeans. We're looking like Americans. We're losing who we are. Remember, they've been who they were longer than the West has been what it was. The West has only been around for a couple hundred years. And not really that when you look at its industrial revolution and its industrial exportation of its culture. That's only been like 125 years. And so this is a nation that's been around for thousands of years, 1,500 at least. And so you're seeing who are these new people? Who is this new nation having such a tremendous effect on the way our youth are thinking and acting. We're becoming way too loose, way too immoral. And that was what they saw. And of course, why? Because oil. Oil is really what brought the Western culture predominantly into that region. And meaning money. And that's where you get the arrangements that Britain made with certain families to give these people at the top money. The Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. And that didn't just happen since America. That's always been the case throughout history. So you can be bought, you can be bribed. Then you make alliances that'll give you more money. And some people make those alliances because then they want to use that money to buy weapons and to fuel their attack on you in the future. But there are religious groups that are far more extreme and they don't care about the money. Osama bin Laden was that way, even though his family cared about the money. They tried to calm him down. But you'll get somebody who's more extreme, more dedicated to their beliefs that cannot be bought. And a man that cannot be bought, good or bad, is the most dangerous man. And for the Muslims that could be bought, no problem. For the ones who cannot be bought, they got a problem. You can't always appease people with money, particularly when they have an ideology. And their ideology could not be bought. They hated it. And that fueled what was happening in Iran in the 70s, in the revolution, and the overthrow of the Shah. And they considered Western countries so morally bankrupt, and we are and were, we were and are, to who they were, that it was not as dangerous until we entered their territory and made deals with them with oil. We needed the oil. And had it not been for the oil, there wouldn't have been any connection with these Islamic nations in the Middle East, just none. The only connection we would have had was our alliance with Israel, and obviously our support of Israel and the defense of Israel. But oil blurred the alliances and the agreements. And all kinds of compromising things were being done because of money and oil. But in the midst of money and oil are people that are religious, are people that have deep views that cannot be bought. And those are the people that will rise up and disrupt it all. And that is what happened in Iran and in many countries. And in some degree, the divide in America between the Christian evangelical fundamentalists and the progressives. See, there are people in this country that, in America, that want nothing more than massive gay rights, lesbian rights. They took the Ten Commandments out of the schools. We used to have the Ten Commandments posted in every classroom. They were taking the Ten Commandments out of the courts. Every court had a sign of the Ten Commandments, basic human laws that work. They've always worked. But it had invoked God. Well, you didn't exist because there was no God. You've always existed because of God, and the nations were built because of God. Atheists did not build any great nation. And these people grew up to hate the reason why they exist because of men and people of faith, physicists like Isaac Newton, man of faith, man of God, scholar. They hate God. Ultimately, they have a hatred of God the way many Islamists have a hatred of Jews, or white supremacists have a hatred of anybody with black skin. You've got a lot of this hatred that is no matter what. They could care less about you having money. They could care less. They just want you dead because they have these extreme views. And Islam saw itself, the Shiite group, and I think the Shiite or Sunni, really, they are, apart from the fight for the caliphate, they have the same rules. They go by the Sharia law, the Hadith, both. And some sold out and some did not. Malcolm X was more militant than Reverend Martin Luther King, who wasn't militant at all. And so you could get those people that were militant. There are whites that are not militant, and there are whites that were, the militias and the Ku Klux Klan. You can get militant groups. It's okay to want your culture to survive, want your race to survive, not want to mix your race. But if you get a militant group, it's not enough that they want it in a civil way. They want it in any way and by all means necessary to disrupt and to destroy. And that's what happened in the Middle East, both in Lebanon and in Iran. See, Iraq was a little different. Iraq and Jordan are rather similar, you know. As long as the oil and the money is flowing, you know, they don't really care about the ideological religious part. They want shiny glass, they want money, they want wealth. But the ones that have real views, good or bad, are the ones that are going to drive the revolution, the change, the chaos, the war, and the peace. So you've got to understand that you can try to make it political, but you really can't. At its core, it's a war between good and evil, your morals against my immorality, your fundamentalism against my liberalism. And that's how it was seen. And while it may have it's rooted in some truth. You know, every lie has to have some truth. Every movement has to have something that it sounds good. We all are going to be equal. See, it sounds good, but it doesn't work in communism, Marxism, socialism. It doesn't, right? It has something about it. The immoral part of their argument, like the moral part of the argument in America in the early 1900s, has some truth to it. Has some truth. You want to be moral. But then when they have power, what are they going to do? Is it just about the morality? Is it just about the fact that this immoral? What else is behind it? You know, we don't pray to statues. Neither does Islam. But if you're Catholic, even Protestants are against that. Islam's against that. Cultures that say you don't pray to statues, you don't craft something. Jews are against that. That's in the Torah, right? So you can find things that you share alike. Christians, Muslims, and Jews share a lot alike. But it's that difference that makes all the difference between the three groups that you've got to understand. And while they share, most of their moral codes are alike. Fundamental Christianity shares, particularly Protestantism, more than Catholicism, shares pretty much the same moral views as Jews and Muslims. Now, all of them, even Hinduism, shares the same views when it comes to adultery and fornication and sexual dishonor. So you can find where the threads are alike and where they are not. And where they are unalike is where the greatest gap will be. So it's not what we share in common, it's more what we don't. But you can see where they have been given a great deal of moral authority when they're looking at the West, talking about Islam. They're looking at the West. And it's very hard to fight without moral authority. But when you feel you have it, or you have it, it gives you a fervor and a dedication and a following that is not going to turn. It don't matter how many bombs you drop on them. They're not going to turn because they're not there because of bombs or no bombs. They're there because they have a moral, ideological belief religiously that drives them to resist you because you seem to represent everything that's the antithesis of their faith and their God. And we see the same thing in our country. The same moral revolution in our country. Why people have marched. The difference is This is not a religious country. So everybody gets an equal opportunity to destroy it. So the LGBT and the feminists and the Satanists and the militia groups can march and destroy with the same aggression, and the courts will support it as much as those that are against them. But now that the courts and the systems and the corporations look more like the other side, we are becoming a progressive republic. We're becoming a nation where the king, the Christian king, allegedly, of the 60s has been replaced by the progressive ones like Obama and Biden. And the courts have been replaced. And Khomeini controls the court system. The Islamists control that. Christians do not no longer control the court systems in America. So we, in kind, are not that different than Iran. The terrorism of ideological liberalism and progressivism has destroyed womanhood, families, and children. And I wanted to give you this to understand and then urge you all to do your own homework on the history of Iran, Islamism, in Lebanon and in Iran, and understand the difference. If you don't understand your own country first, what happened in our country with the sexual revolution of the 60s, it's been documented for years. The marketers, the ad companies of New York, they made smoking popular and made it and told you it was healthy. They made women working outside the home and not raising their children the way a woman should be. They made makeup and bleaching of your hair true beauty because you're ugly with your natural hair. And they made the quest and the lust for gold and oil and money the driving force of manhood. And then they made the man focus like a Greek statue on the gay attitude of muscles, muscles, muscles. Flesh, flesh, flesh. Thank you, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Vanity, vanity, vanity. And then the French said it's all about the fashion or no fashion at all. Just wear nothing, just wear a string. And it got to the point where it became self-hating. You just hate being a human. Have a dog. Stop having babies. In fact, abort them. Forget sex is for procreation. It's for fun. And so, in the United States of America, we have completely lost all of our moral fiber. It is in our music. It's almost in every church, in any church you walk into, which is about 90% of them. It's performance, it's a nightclub, it's a show, it's all about sex, it's all about feminism, it's all about can we all get along? It's no longer God's law, it's man's coleslaw. It's mixed with junk. We have our own revolution. And it's all a mess because we have abandoned God's Torah. And that's how the Islamists see it in Iran.